Hi, viewers. Hi, everyone. And we will be starting this session within 2 minutes. We'll try to wait for few viewers, few people who are really interested in energy talks, how the energy is shifting in terms of security. And then we will start with our session, which is specifically to 2 to 3 points, which are interesting in terms of how finance can work in development and also in construction phase in terms of geopolitical conflicts, war, and other issues that which is going on and which is hindering our economic stability and socio-economic benefits as well. So today we are live here to imagine a number, right? And I'll say $2.7 trillion. That's not the GDP of a country. That's not the cost of the entire global energy transition. That's how much the world spends in its military in 2024. In 1 year, $2.7 trillion, the highest figure ever recorded in human history. According to SIPRI, the Stockholm International Speech Peace Research Institute, and it went up to 9.4% from the year before. The steepest rise since the end of the Cold War. Welcome to the show. I'm Saikat, your host, and today we are going to somehow most energy podcasts don't show and don't go there, right? We are going to follow the money because here's the thing: nobody puts on the same slide the same year 2024 the total amount of international public finance sent to developing countries to build clean energy infrastructure was 21.7 $21.7 billion. Not trillion, billion. 21.7 billion. So let me say that again very slowly. Military spending, $2.7 trillion. Clean energy finance for the countries that need it most, $21.7 billion. That is the ratio roughly 125 is to 2 is to 1. So for every dollar sent to help a developing nation build a solar panel, a mini grid, or a clean cooking system, or maybe somehow which is relatable to their benefit, is $125 went somewhere else. Most of it to weapons, ammunitions, bases, and machineries for war. So 666 million people wake up without electricity. Still, not fewer than that last year, not a rounding up error. 666 million human beings right now are without electricity. So today's episode is about the connection between those three numbers. And when we talk about the three numbers, why not to just unfold everything because they are not separate stories. They are the same stories. The finance that should be powering the energy transition is being diverted by governments, by institutions, by a global system that has decided implicitly that security comes from the missiles rather than from megawatts. Let's deeply dive in and let's break it down slowly and one by one. This is going to take 30 minutes of your time, but I promise it will be worth every one of them. Let's start with what we know is being spent and what we don't. Because at the end of the day, I promised you I'll give you 3 pointers to take away. In 2024, global military expenditure hits 20, no, I'll try to explain you more, right? It's $2,718 billion. So this is not just a big number, right? This is not just a number. It's an structural pattern. Military spending has risen every single year from the past 10 years. Every single years it has gone up to 37% in a decade. So in 10 years, you can see the trajectory and dramatical increase. And governments are publicly committing to increase it further. They are not stopping to just tell in front of everyone. NATO members, who already accounted for 55% of all global military spending, agreed earlier this week and this year to raise their spending target to 2% of GDP to 3.5%, with an additional 1.5% for what they have calling defense related expenditure. If that happens, International Peace Bureau estimated that global military spending could reach between 4.7 trillion dollars and 6.6 trillion dollars by 2035. Now, I need you to sit with the number 6.6 trillion dollars. That's what we're calling, right? In this episode, the numbers. That is not a defense budget. This is a civilization level choice. And there's a choice being made without a single global debate, without dedicated UN accountability mechanisms, and without a single monetary mandatory sustainable impact, which the assessment should have been done. I'm not joking here, but yes, there is no reports. They don't have to report. The US alone spends $997 billion in 2024, nearly, I guess, trillion dollars from a single country in a single year. Germany became the fourth largest military spend in the world, overtaking India. Now, Russia's military budget jumped from 87% to 149 billion, consuming 19% of all Russian government spending. Israel's military budget surged 65% to 46.5 billion, and the steepest annual increase since the Six-Day War in 1964. So these numbers, what we spoke about, are reported. So imagine if those are reported, what would be the actual number? They appear in SIPRI's annual release. But here is what is most never reported alongside them. What was the spend and what was the spending in is costing in climate, right? In energy, in the future of communities, bearing the heaviest burden of both. But wait, the money is not the problem in the story because war doesn't just consume public finances, they consume atmosphere, they consume the statistical fluctuations of entire pollutions. Here's the statistics that should be on every single climate policy table, isn't it? Right. So routine military operations, not war fighting, not conflict, but day-to-day operation of world's military forces are estimated to account 5.5% of all global greenhouse gas emissions. Just day to day. I'm not talking about any war, I'm not talking any conflicts, or I'm not talking any exercise or something. It's just day to day. So 5.5%. So if the world's militaries were a country, they could have been the fourth largest national emitter on the earth. The fourth. And right now, when we are talking about how to stop the global warming, how to stop the global rise of temperature, why don't we also report why this military emissions and other emissions, which is related to the war, conflict, geopolitics, to be reported as well, right? And here it is the higher than Russia. So in Russia, whatever we have, the pollutions and whatever they have been said one of the polluters. If that country was made accordingly, collecting all the militaries, they are higher than the Russia alone. And here is the scandal, right? The scandal is embedded in that number. So militaries are only major sector explicitly exempt from reporting their emissions, which is under the international climate agreements. Wow. So a US insertion into the Kyoto Protocol in 1997 created a loophole that has never been closed. which meant the 5.5% figure is almost certainly an underestimated because it's built on incomplete data from nationals or national that are not legally required to tell the truth about their carbon footprints. So if you say whether we are going to net zero, whether I don't know because everything is not been reported. Now add active conflicts. So Russia's war in Ukraine has generated 230 million tons of CO2, which is equivalent, right? Since it began in February 2022. This is more than the combined annual emissions of Austria, Hungary, the Czech Republic, Slovakia. And 27% of those emissions came out from the fighting itself. But from the reconstruction of buildings after the war, power stations, and other infrastructure that were destroyed, right? So imagine those will also add on into the number. In Gaza, researchers from Queen Mary University of London found that carbon footprints of the first 15 months of conflict will be the greater than annual emission of more than 100 individual countries. So the immediate fighting generated the equivalent of 32 million tons of CO2. 32 million tons of CO2. And rebuilding that 156,000 to 200,000 structures destroyed will be generating about between 46.8 billion to 60 billion million additional tons. So 48 to 60 million. This is emissions compared to Portugal or Sweden from one small trip of land in just over a year of conflict. Now, here is what makes this different relevant to the energy conversation. When infrastructure is destroyed in conflict, power plants, grid lines, water treatment, desalination, infrastructure, it is not just a humanitarian catastrophe. Those are catastrophe that is been done, right? And it is an energy catastrophe that will take decades, and hundreds of billions of dollars to reverse. And every dollar spent rebuilding the infrastructure that was deliberately destroyed is a dollar not spent building new infrastructure for clean, resilient energy, grid communities that have never had it. So, where the money is going? Who is accountable for that? And then there is the third element that connects war finances to the energy, which is the fossil fuel subsidies, the elephant in the room, guys. So in 2022, governments around the world spent $1.53 trillion dollars on direct fossil fuel subsidies, a new record according to UN. And although they fell to, I think, 1.1 trillion in 2023 as an energy price drop, right? They are still three times higher than they are before in the pandemic. So three times higher. And the IMF estimates that if you include implicit subsidies, the cost of pollution, climate damages, and health impacts that government absorbs but don't price. So total fossil fuel subsidies were $7 trillion in 2020. Again, I'm saying $7 trillion. Now, connect that to the war story. Over 80% of the world's proven fossil fuel reserves are concentrated in conflicts affected or fragile regions, right? So maybe the regions which are affected, or maybe maybe the areas which are prone to effect, right? So pro revenues are fund militaries. Imagine how they have been loop like circled and how everything is designed, the mechanism. So petro revenues sustains authoritarian regimes. Petro revenues create the economic instabilities and incentives for resource war. The Gulf, Central Asia, and Sahel, the geography of fossil fuels and the geography of armed conflict overlaps. most perfect, right? You have a triangle. So whenever we have a triangle, the triangle always says fossil fuel subsidies finance the extractions, petro revenue finance the militaries, and the militaries protect the extractions and fight resource war. So imagine. And the communities at the end bearing the cost of all three in lost climate finances, in destroyed infrastructure, in poisoned air and water. They're the communities that have the least electricity, the least grid stability, and the least voice in the room where the decisions are made. They are being kept as an observer if they're lucky. So where does all of this leaves us? What does it means concretely for the 666 million people without electricity? And for the energy transition, what is supposed to serve them? Question one. Grid investments in EMDEs is falling at 7% per year despite rising demands. War destroys infrastructure and resets year of progress. The communities most composed of conflicts are the same communities that are the weakest grids and the least leverage to attract replacement finances. Second, capital providers need data. Data requires digital systems, and digital systems require capital. So this is not a market failure. It is a government's failure recurring and requiring consumption financing, grants, and public first loss capitals. The finance paradox will not be solved by better algorithms. It requires political decisions to deploy public money at scale. Governance and capacity is a primary determination of private energy infrastructure investments and conflicts destroys governance institutions. Also, alongside physical infrastructures and institutions as well. So, resetting regularities capacity, displacing trained officials, and creating regulatory vacuums that prevent risk capitals from entering and diverging are the important stuff. Rebuilding governance is slower and less visible than rebuilding power lines, right? So, but without it, the power lines will never be built. Okay. So, we definitely defined three compounding structural cries. So, imagine at the starting, I promised you guys that at the initial level, we will have a defined three structured commodities or compounding structural framework mechanism. According to me, it should be happening. Now, you might be thinking, this is a lot of diagnosis, right? And not yet a lot of medicines. Because remember, when there's a war, when there's a conflict, there's always an issue of hospitalizations, casualties, and casualties means massive casualties where they need medicines on the spot. They need accountability, they need people who can treat them, and the infrastructure for hospitals and others. But during that time, when the war is being conflicted, the money is being diverted from fossil fuels to military spending and the military spending to war machineries, the gap is humans. So here, I'm leaving you with three things, right? Just three things that I already promised. One is the numbers. Write them down. Use them. 2.7 trillion in military spending in 2024. 2.6 billion in clean energy finances for developing countries. 125 to 1 ratio. 230 million tons of CO2 from the Ukraine war. Up to 92 million tons from the Gaza. 5.5% of global emissions from militaries with zero reporting requirements. With zero reporting requirements. And these are not just taking points, they are the architecture of a system that is choosing a very specific kind of world. And you now know what the architecture looks like. Second, the framework. The three track innovation model is not an utopian vision. It is a description of work that needs to exist in a larger dimensions, but also doesn't need to be involved into various capacities of conflicts and wars, right? So track one is happening, track two and track three are not at the scale they need to be. If you work in energy finance, in policies, in technology, in civil societies, ask yourself which track you work on. And if the answer is track one, ask yourself what it would take to redirect even 10% of it. Third, the connection. The finance paradox, the infrastructure, chicken and egg, the government's capacity contradiction. These are not separate problems with separate solutions. These are unique and they have the same problem and the same solutions. They are three phases of same political choice. The spend public money on destructions rather than construction. Making that choice visible is the first step to changing it, right? So next week in the show, we'll be going in deeper into track two. I want to talk specifically about on offline first design principles, about the communities building their own energy tools, and about what appropriate innovation actually look like on the ground. Subsidies, yes, of course we need it, but also I need your subscription. So subscribe if you don't, so that you don't miss it. I'm Saikat Das. Thank you for spending 30 minutes with me, and it actually matters to me. Hopefully, I'll see you next week, next time. But before that, I'm giving you an opportunity. So I'll wait for 2 minutes if someone wants to join the live show with me. Someone wants to talk about their experience, about the finances, about what they think about energy crisis and where we are right now. How can we move on? And how can we develop a shield to prevent ourselves from degrading the economy and also getting a full energy access. The link is in the bio. If you are in any social media watching me, you can find the link in the bio or in the comments, and you can just tap in by saying I want to get in. There's a button, and just click the button. You'll be here in the studio with me. And unless that, you are with me in Let's Talk Energy with Saikat. And here we disclose, we debunk, we talk, and we discuss about not too much technical, but also in human perspective, how energy is changing our life. So, viewers, until then, see you next time. And if no one is joining, our guest today was a very knowledgeable guest about all fundings, finances, sustainable climate, subsidies, loss and damage, and how we can redirect and reroute the subsidies from fossil fuel to renewable energies and clean energies. But yeah, at the last moment, there was an emergency. Um, she cannot join us. But next time, definitely we'll have the discussion with some experts. But today, I guess it was a lot of numbers, a lot of pointers, and mostly the statistics that I gave you, the data that I gave you. Take those data, have some discussions around your network, dig in, and research what exactly we are missing, and then start questioning. Because when we start question, then we have a discussion, and when you have a discussion, come and let's speak energy with me. Until then, see you next time. Take care of yourself, and yes, thanks a lot for being with me.